July 1990, Bangkok International Airport. Two British girls, 17 and 19, stand frozen as Thai police unzip their suitcases. What begins as a routine inspection quickly turns into a moment that would change their lives forever. Inside the bags lies nearly 26 kilos of heroin, the largest single drug seizure in Thailand's history at the time. Both girls stare in disbelief, insisting they know nothing about it. Their faces pale, their voices tremble, but the evidence before them speaks louder than their denial. In that instant, the dream of a free holiday in paradise collapses into a nightmare of foreign prisons, death sentences, and headlines that will echo across Britain. Were Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith naive tourists who trusted the wrong people, or willing participants who thought they could outsmart the law? That question, hanging between innocence and guilt, would divide families, ignite political pressure, and expose the uneasy truth about how far youth, ignorance, and misplaced trust can destroy a life. Patricia Ann Cahill was born in 1973 and grew up in West Heath, Birmingham, in a working-class Catholic family of Irish immigrant roots. Her upbringing was shaped by modest surroundings and traditional values. Those who knew her described her as a spirited, sometimes stubborn girl, raised with a clear sense of right and wrong. Her father once told the BBC that Patricia was dead against drugs, dead against abortions and things like that. Yet beneath those convictions, there were already signs of quiet rebellion. Before her arrest in Thailand, she had a previous conviction for shoplifting in Birmingham. A small crime, but one that hinted at a willingness to test boundaries. Just 2 years older, Karyn Smith was born in 1971 and raised on the Damson Wood estate in Solihull. Her background was equally humble. Her father worked as a hospital technician, and her mother managed the home. Teachers remembered her as a kind but struggling student. She had learning difficulties, failed her exams, and often appeared lost in a system that had little patience for those who fell behind. Investigators later described her as unusually naive, and that phrase would come to define her role in everything that followed. In early 1990, Patricia and Karyn met for the first time. They came from different corners of the Midlands but were united by a shared loneliness and a hunger for escape. Patricia, more confident and street-aware, naturally took the lead. Karyn, still recovering from depression and unstable housing, found in Patricia a friend who offered belonging and excitement. Within weeks, they became inseparable. The best of friends, as reports later described. Their bond, though genuine, carried a dangerous imbalance. Patricia paid the bills, planned their nights out, and made decisions. Karyn followed her lead without much question. They spent weekends at Birmingham's Dome nightclub, one of the city's most popular venues at the time. Music, lights, and the illusion of adulthood gave them a sense of freedom their everyday lives couldn't. But beneath the laughter and late nights, trouble was already taking shape. In June 1990, the pair were charged with stealing 3 dictaphones, a minor but telling offence. When the case went to court, neither appeared, and a warrant was issued for their arrest. It was a sign of how quickly their choices were spiralling beyond control. What began as petty defiance, small acts of rebellion against ordinary life, was slowly drawing them towards something far darker. Neither of them knew it, but the path they were walking would soon lead them thousands of miles from home, into a country with laws far harsher than they could imagine. Their story, at this stage, was still one of youth and poor judgment. Yet within months, those same choices would turn their names into symbols of both sympathy and controversy across Britain. By the summer of 1990, Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith's friendship had become inseparable. What began as a bond between two restless young women quickly turned into emotional dependency. Patricia was the confident one, street smart, outspoken, and used to taking control. Karyn, on the other hand, looked up to her. She was quieter, less certain of herself, and often followed Patricia's lead without question. The two filled gaps in each other's lives. Patricia offered direction, and Karyn offered loyalty. Together, they created their own world, one that promised freedom from boredom and the struggles waiting at home. Most weekends, they could be found at Birmingham's Dome nightclub. The flashing lights, loud music, and crowded dance floors gave them a sense of escape that ordinary life never did. In that environment, they felt powerful, grown up, and untouchable. Yet beneath the excitement, their choices were beginning to drift toward trouble. Both had already been charged with stealing 3 dictaphones earlier that year, a small crime, but one that showed how easily they crossed lines when it suited them. When they failed to appear in court, warrants were issued for their arrest. It didn't seem serious to them at the time. They were too caught up in chasing moments of fun and belonging. Their relationship had developed an uneven balance. Patricia made the plans, handled money, and spoke for both of them. Karyn depended on her guidance, rarely making independent choices. Friends later said Patricia seemed to enjoy the control, while Karyn just wanted someone to care. That imbalance would become dangerous when real risk entered their lives. It was around this time that a British man appeared, friendly, persuasive, and offering something that sounded like a dream. An all-expenses-paid holiday to Thailand, a country neither girl had ever thought about visiting. The offer seemed too good to question. The man promised sunshine, new experiences, and a chance to escape the dull routine of Birmingham. Neither Patricia nor Karyn understood who they were dealing with or what his motives truly were. At 17 and 19, they were still children in many ways, old enough to crave adventure, but too inexperienced to sense danger. They didn't ask why a stranger would pay for their tickets. They didn't question the sudden generosity. All they saw was an opportunity to leave their problems behind, to start fresh somewhere far away. What they couldn't know was that this one decision, to accept a free trip from someone they barely knew, would set off a chain of events that neither friendship nor innocence could save them from. Their story, until this point, had been one of youthful mistakes and harmless rebellion. But the moment they said yes to that offer, it crossed into something far darker. The line between adventure and ruin had been drawn, and they had already stepped over it. When the offer first came, it sounded like a dream. A free trip to Thailand, sun, beaches, shopping, and escape from the dreary monotony of Birmingham. The man who arranged it seemed worldly and generous. He promised luxury hotels, nightlife, and no expense spared. For 2 young girls chasing adventure, there was no reason to refuse. Patricia Cahill, confident and streetwise, saw it as a chance to prove she could live larger than life. Karyn Smith, shy and uncertain, simply followed. What began as friendship had already turned into quiet dependence. Cahill led, Smith followed. Every decision blurred into loyalty rather than judgment. They told their parents they were going to Scotland. It was easier than explaining a spontaneous foreign trip funded by someone they barely knew. To them, Thailand was a postcard, a paradise far from the dull streets and small troubles that had begun to shadow their lives. The pair imagined days of laughter and nights of bright city lights. Neither questioned the strange generosity that paid for everything: flights, hotels, meals, even spending money. The journey itself felt intoxicating. Bangkok greeted them with heat, noise, and color. The man who had arranged everything played the perfect host, reassuring, smooth, and always in control. He treated them to fine dinners, guided tours, and endless praise. The atmosphere was disarming. For once, the girls felt admired, almost special. They believed they had stepped into a different world, one where the rules of home no longer applied. But beneath the illusion of safety, something darker was in motion. The man began to grow distant, delegating small errands, then disappearing for hours. When he returned, he carried luggage they hadn't seen before, claiming it was for friends or for their return journey. Cahill and Smith didn't ask questions. Trust came easily when wrapped in charm and confidence. What harm could come from following instructions? Days passed quickly. As the trip neared its end, the man informed them their return tickets were ready. He handed over 2 suitcases, insisting they take them through customs. They were told these belonged to a friend and contained gifts. The girls, tired and naive, accepted without hesitation. Their last night in Thailand was restless. Both felt uneasy but couldn't explain why. Karyn later recalled a faint sense that something was wrong, but it was easier to ignore it than to challenge the man who had made their journey possible. The following morning, they arrived at Don Mueang Airport. Check-in lines moved slowly, their laughter masking the quiet anxiety beneath. As their bags passed through inspection, one of the officers paused. Another joined. The girls exchanged uncertain glances. When the zips opened and the white powder appeared, time seemed to stop. The dream of escape had turned into a nightmare. In a single instant, two teenagers from Birmingham found themselves trapped in a foreign country, accused of smuggling heroin worth millions and facing a justice system that showed no mercy. At Bangkok International Airport, the atmosphere was routine until it wasn't. Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith moved through the departure hall like any other travelers. Their faces were calm, even cheerful, unaware that their next few steps would decide the rest of their lives. As their suitcases slid across the inspection table, one of the customs officers frowned. Something about the weight, the texture, or perhaps the traveler's demeanor. Whatever it was, it drew attention. The officer gestured for the bags to be opened. What followed unfolded with the clinical precision. One layer of clothes was lifted, then another, until the lining of each suitcase began to bulge under the officer's hand. A small incision was made. A fine white powder spilled out. The test kit confirmed it almost instantly. Heroin. Not a few grams, not even a kilo, but more than 26 kilograms concealed across both bags. It was one of the largest single narcotic seizures ever recorded at the time. The moment froze. The girls stood speechless. Smith's eyes widened in disbelief. Cahill's face drained of color. They protested that they knew nothing, that the suitcases weren't theirs, that someone must have planted it. But the officers were unmoved. In Thailand, drugs were not a misunderstanding. They were a death sentence waiting to be enforced. Within minutes, the pair were surrounded by armed police. The airport noise faded into the background. They were taken to a holding area, hands trembling, voices cracking as the reality sank in. They didn't know the Thai language. They didn't understand the procedures. What they did know, from the sharp tones and the looks of those around them, was that this was no small matter. In Britain, drug possession meant prison. In Thailand, it could mean the firing squad. That difference, vast and terrifying, now hung over two teenagers who had barely crossed the threshold into adulthood. As they were questioned, the officers recorded their statements through translators. Both insisted they were innocent, tourists tricked into carrying someone else's luggage. But to Thai officials, such claims were familiar. Every trafficker said the same. For hours, the questioning continued. The heat, exhaustion, and fear began to wear them down. Patricia tried to remain composed, repeating her story with controlled precision. Karyn, the younger of the two, broke down repeatedly, unable to make sense of how a holiday had become a criminal nightmare. The officers remained stern, methodical, and detached. By nightfall, the girls were transferred to the infamous Lard Yao women's prison. There, the enormity of their situation began to surface. Cells overcrowded, food scarce, and conditions harsh. A world far removed from the comfort of home. For two British girls raised in ordinary households, it was unthinkable. Days later, under the suffocating pressure of interrogation and isolation, Karyn Smith gave a partial confession. She admitted that she suspected something was wrong, but claimed she had no real knowledge of what was in the bags. She said she thought they were carrying souvenirs, not heroin. To the Thai authorities, that was an admission of guilt. To her, it was a desperate attempt to tell the truth as she understood it. Back in the UK, headlines exploded. Britons faced death penalty in Thailand. Families who thought their daughters were in Scotland now faced the horror of international law. The story became a diplomatic crisis and a moral riddle. Were these girls naive victims or willing couriers blinded by greed? Inside the prison, neither question mattered. Their world had shrunk to four walls, iron bars, and an unshakable dread of what came next. As the doors closed each night, silence filled the space where hope once lived. The journey that began with laughter and promise had ended in the stillness of captivity. Two young lives suspended between guilt and tragedy. By December 1990, the case had become an international spectacle. In Bangkok's criminal court, Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith stood trial for one of the gravest offences under Thai law, trafficking heroin. Every day, reporters crowded outside, cameras flashing as two British teenagers, barely out of school, faced the possibility of execution. Inside, the air was thick with judgment. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision: 26 kilograms of heroin hidden in luggage, possession beyond denial, intent beyond question. The girls insisted they were tricked, but in a Thai courtroom, ignorance was no defense. Cultural contrasts made the trial even more striking. In Thailand, drug trafficking was treated not as a crime of greed, but a moral corruption deserving death. For the British public, it was a tragic story of youth and manipulation. Two naive girls caught in a foreign system they could not understand. The press back home oscillated between sympathy and condemnation. Some painted them as innocent victims led astray by older criminals. Others called them reckless thrill seekers who had to face the consequences. When the verdict came, silence filled the courtroom. Karyn Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment. Patricia Cahill, just 17 at the time of the offence, was spared the death penalty under Thai law and given a 15-year sentence instead. The court recognised her age, but not her innocence. For both, it was the end of freedom, a lifetime measured in years behind bars. The weight of that judgment shattered the facade of youthful denial. Smith broke down in tears. Cahill, more restrained, stared blankly ahead as the interpreter read out the sentence. To the Thai officials, justice had been served. To their families, watching from afar, it was an unbearable punishment born of a single act of blind trust. Back in Britain, the reaction was divided. Some demanded government intervention, arguing that the punishment was too harsh. Others believed Thailand's law was clear and that the girls had taken their chances. The media's relentless coverage turned their parents into reluctant public figures, forced to defend, explain, and endure the moral trial of their daughters' choices. For Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith, the courtroom was not just a place of judgment, but the final proof that their old lives were gone. The laughter of Birmingham nights, the imagined glamour of travel, all replaced by the echo of a foreign sentence they could barely comprehend. The story that began with friendship had now become a lesson in fate, a culture, and the irreversible cost of ignorance. As the months turned into years, the story of Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith refused to fade from public memory. What began as a criminal case had become a diplomatic balancing act between two very different systems of justice. In Britain, campaigns called for compassion, arguing that the girls were too young to fully grasp the enormity of their crime. Families, lawyers, and journalists painted them as victims of manipulation rather than hardened traffickers. In Thailand, however, the law was absolute. The drugs were real, and the conviction stood. Behind the scenes, the British Embassy in Bangkok began petitioning for leniency. Officials walked a tightrope between respecting Thailand's sovereignty and appeasing growing pressure from the British public. The case drew the attention of both governments, sparking debates over whether foreign prisoners should be subject to royal pardons. The Thai monarchy, known for occasionally granting clemency on humanitarian grounds, became central to the negotiations. Public opinion in Britain was divided. Some saw the campaign for release as an act of national responsibility, protecting citizens even from their own mistakes. Others saw it as moral hypocrisy, a convenient blindness to another country's laws. The tension captured a deeper question. How far should a nation go to defend its own when they break the rules abroad? By 1993, after intense diplomatic exchanges and appeals for mercy, Patricia Cahill was granted a royal pardon and released early. She returned to Britain after serving just 3 years of her 15-year sentence. The official justification centered on her youth and capacity for reform, a gesture of forgiveness framed as moral duty. Her release was met with quiet relief and public scrutiny. Some welcomed her home as a reformed young woman who had paid for her mistake. Others believed justice had been undermined. But one fact was undeniable. International pressure had rewritten the ending of a story that once seemed certain to end in tragedy. The story of Patricia Cahill and Karyn Smith did not end with their release. It lingered in newspapers, documentaries, and debates about justice and morality. Their case became one of the earliest modern examples of what happens when youthful recklessness collides with the uncompromising force of foreign law. To many in Britain, it was a lesson in cultural misunderstanding, how two teenagers from Birmingham could be judged by a system shaped by a completely different moral code. To others, it was a reminder that ignorance, however sincere, is never a shield from consequence. The case left an imprint far beyond Thailand. Its themes, innocence, guilt, and the blurred line between the two inspired later works, including the 1999 film Brokedown Palace, a dramatized account of two young women trapped abroad in a drug smuggling scandal. Though loosely based on events like Cahill and Smith's, it captured the same haunting moral question. How easily can ordinary lives unravel when trust is misplaced? After their return, both women faded from public view. Cahill built a quiet life away from attention, while Smith struggled with the weight of her past. The media occasionally revisited their names, but the frenzy that once defined their existence gradually turned to silence. What remained was the enduring narrative. Two British girls, drawn by adventure, undone by deceit, and remembered as symbols of youthful vulnerability in an unforgiving world. More than 3 decades later, their story still provokes reflection. It exposes the fragile boundary between curiosity and danger, between freedom and responsibility. It reminds the world that justice is not universal, that in crossing borders, one also crosses into another society's values and consequences. And above all, it leaves a final truth. Sometimes, the most devastating prisons are not made of bars, but of memories and regret.